All right, let's look into the central nervous system. And so we're going to start off the central nervous system looking at the spinal cord. So let's look at the structure of the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord there. There are 31 segments of the spinal cord. And each segment, right there is one segment. Each segment has a pair of spinal nerves. You can see one going off to the right, one going off to the left. Okay. So what we also see in looking at our spinal cord, if we go to, this picture shows it here, is that we have a cervical enlargement and we have a lumbar enlargement down here. So we have a cervical enlargement, and this is going to supply nerves to our upper limbs, right? So a lot of neurons coming out of there, a lot of those cell bodies for those motor neurons up there. And then a lumbar enlargement, this supplies nerves to the lower limbs, all right? So let's take a look at the functions of the spinal cord. One function is that we have a lot of reflexes that go through there. So we have spinal reflexes. So these are reflexes whose reflex arcs pass through the spinal cord. So that's one function of the spinal cord. The other is conduction of nerve impulses. So we're sending signals either up the spinal cord or down the spinal cord. So the first tracks are called ascending tracks. So this is highlighting some ascending tracks. And these are tracks that are going to conduct sensory input to the brain, so going up. So if I touch something, then that input's going back up to my brain. Now if I want stuff coming out, that's going to go down descending tracks. So this is highlighted in purple there, some descending tracks there. So these are tracks that are going to conduct motor impulses from the brain to effectors, right? So going down out of our brain through our spinal cord out to the body somewhere. Now, if we look at this picture here, you notice that this is sensory here. Here that impulse is starting, we'll just say this is the right side, and then it moves over here to the left side of the brain. Okay? And if we look at the motor division here that impulse starts here on the left side of the brain, moves out to the right side of the body. Okay? So what we see here is these tracks cross over. And they cross over in the part of our brain, so this is showing these slices here. This is the cerebrum, this is the midbrain, there's a pons, this is the medulla oblongata. And so the medulla oblongata is a part of our brain where these tracks cross over. So both sensory and motor there, all right? So what that means is the left side of our brain controls the right side of our body and vice versa. The right side of our brain controls the left side of our body, all right? And I know a lot of people have heard that before. Okay. Let's look at our brain. Now, our brain is composed of about 100 billion multipolar neurons. All right, so let's take a look at the cerebrum. The cerebrum, in general, so just to show on this picture, this upper part right here is the cerebrum. If I go to the next picture, all you're seeing there is cerebrum. All this is cerebrum. All right, so in general, it contains nerve centers for sensory and motor functions. It also provides our higher mental functions. Where you reside is in your cerebrum, all right? It is the largest part of our brain, and it's divided into two cerebral hemispheres. We have the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere, all right? And so the place that those are connected at, if we go back to this other picture here, is called the corpus callosum. And so this is the corpus callosum right there. It is cut. So this is a bridge that connects the two cerebral hemispheres. All right, so there is a fissure or a deep groove. If we go to this next picture, there's that deep groove, that fissure there, and that divides the two hemispheres all the way down to that corpus callosum. So all this, like they didn't have to cut up here. All right, now when we look at a brain, we not only have that fissure, but we have shallow grooves in there, which you see all over the place, and those shallow grooves are called sulci. All right, and then we have ridges right there and there and there, and those ridges are called gyri, okay? Now, here's the reason why we have those ridges and grooves. If we go to this next picture, or this previous picture here, when we look at this cross through our brain, okay, what we see here is we see this lighter area, that's white matter, and then on the edges here is where we see this darker stuff, and that's gray matter. Now, if you remember, I said white matter is where we do conduction, and gray matter is where we do integration. So integration you can think of, that's our thinking part of our brain. Okay, so if we have all these grooves and ridges, what you can see what that does, instead of that brain being nice and smooth with all these ridges and grooves there, that actually increases surface area. And where do we have our gray matter? Well, we have our gray matter on the surface of our brain. So by having more grooves and ridges in our brain, that allows for more gray matter to be there, and that allows for more integration to be occurring, more thought processes. So that's why that's there. All right, let's move on. This is looking at the different lobes of our cerebrum. All this purple and yellow right there, that is the frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe controls voluntary skeletal muscles and intellectual processes. So more of what you are is right up here in that frontal lobe. So next is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe deals with a lot of sensations. So this is where we have interpret sensations of touch and pressure, pain and temperature. We also gives us understanding of speech, thoughts and feelings occurring there as well. Next is the temporal lobe. So this is the temporal lobe down there. The temporal lobe is where we interpret hearing, smell, and we also interpret visual scenes and music there. And the last one back here is the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is where we control and we interpret visual scenes, vision altogether there. All right. Now, as I keep saying, we interpret these things because all our brain is doing is interpreting sensory information that's being sent to it. All right. And then it reconstructs what that sensory information is giving it. All right. Let's move on to the diencephalon. Okay. So the diencephalon contains the thalamus and hypothalamus. So if we go back to this picture here, this right here is a diencephalon, and it contains the thalamus here and the hypothalamus. So we're just going to move ahead to this picture. There's the thalamus there, hypothalamus there. You can see the pituitary gland is just below that hypothalamus. So the thalamus is a central relay station for sensory input. So all of our sensory information goes through our thalamus, and then from there it gets directed to the appropriate places of our cerebrum. Okay? Our hypothalamus does a lot of stuff. It's one of these areas that helps us maintain homeostasis without us consciously thinking about it. Okay? So it's going to regulate hunger, sleep, thirst, body temperature, water balance, and blood pressure. And it regulates blood pressure by our thirst and water balance. Okay? It also controls our pituitary gland. So by controlling our pituitary gland, we secrete a lot of hormones out of that pituitary gland. So essentially our hypothalamus also controls our endocrine system. Okay, let's move on to the brainstem. So let's go back to this picture again. All of this right here is our brainstem. So seeing over here, brainstem. So that's made of the midbrain. Here's the pons. Here's the medulla oblongata. Now, one of the things I want to mention here is that our brainstem has ascending and descending tracts through it. Okay, so that's going to be in there. So let's look at other stuff that's found in our brainstem. So if we go to this picture here, here's the midbrain, there's the pons, there's the medulla oblongata. This is a backside view of that. Okay, so let's look at the medulla oblongata, the lower portion right there. So the medulla oblongata regulates our heartbeat, our breathing, and our blood pressure. It also has a lot of reflexes. So it has reflexes for vomiting, and coughing, sneezing, hiccups, and swallowing. So next is the pons. So there's the pons. Our pons helps regulate our breathing, so it's going to work with our medulla oblongata there. It also bridges our frontal cortex, frontal lobe of our cerebrum to our cerebellum. And I'll talk about why that's important when we get to our cerebellum next. Next is our midbrain right there, and our midbrain has reflexes through it. So it has visual, auditory, and tactile responses, so head responses. So if you hear a loud noise over here, you turn your head that way towards that noise. That's a reflex that's gone through your midbrain. All right, now let's look at the last one, and that's the cerebellum. So if I go back to this picture here, there's the cerebellum there. So underneath the cerebrum. Oh, by the way, cerebrum just means brain. Cerebellum means little brain. Okay, here's a picture of the cerebellum right there. Here's another picture of the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is a large mass located below the occipital lobe. It also has two hemispheres to it as well. It is primarily white matter. Its main function is muscle coordination. So coordinate our muscles, all right? Now, with that, our frontal lobe controls skeletal muscle functioning. So if I move my arm like so, that's pretty much out of my frontal lobe. But if I walk at all, I gotta coordinate the activity of my right and my left legs together. So I'm using my frontal lobe with my cerebellum, and those pathways are gonna cross through the pons, as I mentioned earlier. Our cerebellum also maintains our posture and muscle tone. Now, if remember, muscle tone is the partial contraction of a muscle.